So, hi everyone. I'm here with Jason Brunet. He's the Chief Business and Strategy Officer for Pyxis Custom Solutions and Peak Performance Solutions, which is a company based in Canada. Jason, we go back quite a long way, but it's very great to see you. Great to see you again, and welcome.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, we go back quite some years ago, I guess, back into your Amex and Bell days in Canada.
So, just to start off, I mean, good to sort of catch up a little bit in terms of what's been happening over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. I mean, there's been massive change that's gone on, I suppose, in the environment with the pandemic and everything that's sort of happened. And it'd be good to how have you sort of seen that, I suppose, in the Canadian market in particular, in terms of how that sort of flowed through the arrears process and the collection cycle.
Yeah, I think what we've seen is really we had to adapt very quickly when the pandemic started back in March, and we had to start moving our workforce out, which was certainly a challenge. I think companies adapted very well and very quickly. I think regulatory bodies changed with the environment as well. So it was really just to get our workforce out, being productive in a safe environment, and to continue with our day-to-day activities, in the collection space and doing the BPO call center service work. So I think after that period, it was just we saw, a workforce that was very engaged and actually doing a good job in hitting their numbers and their targets and all that. So I think the first year with the incentives that were going out, businesses were able to adapt to the environment very quickly. And I think over the course of time now, there's additional challenges with our workforce that are not coming back into the office, which has caused some problems. There's been some recruitment challenges as well. So how do we recruit a labor force? How do we retain that labor force after we've invested in the recruitment and training process? That's sort of where the challenge is, I think, today versus where it was when the pandemic started in March.
And how did people find to I suppose, adapting to working remotely? I suppose particularly in the call center environment, right? Which is you have financial information, those kind of things. Was that relatively seamless? Did you see sort of productivity kind of get maintained, or is it a bit of a drop off, but not too much? I mean, how's that sort of transition sort of managed?
Yeah, I think productivity actually increased at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And I think now it's you still have a labor force that sometimes, if they are working from home, need to be brought back into a safe environment for up training. How do they get connected back to the core business through the culture of the business? So there is still a workforce that has to be brought in from time to time to be supportive of their training needs and really to get them connected back to the business. And to the people. I think it's important as well. But I think, the labor force that have been working from home over a long period of time and who are top producers or producing at a high level, I think companies have to eventually adapt and say, well, how do I bring that workforce back in, especially with the new variants that are coming out every couple of months. And then you have to, you're changing your corporate message of come back in, it's safe, no, go back out, it's not. And I think that's become a little bit of a challenge where we've seen a lot of our workforce just basically say, no, I'm staying home. And how do companies adapt to that?
I mean, is there's in some ways there's an opportunity, right? So if you have remote, because you can pick people up from more remote locations, and that can add to flexibility in workforce and those kind of things. Sure. I suppose versus having people in the office, which has got the benefits of, cultural type, you sort of imbuing the culture in terms of how you treat customers, those kind of things. If you're having people sort of face to face, I mean, is that kind of a balance that you'll go through? And what's the solution going forward? Is it just flexibility, or do you think we're going to land on one or the other?
Well, I think it is flexibility, and to your point about getting or trying to recruit a labor force outside of your circle or your environment. I would say that companies maybe haven't taken advantage of that as much as they could. Basically, you kind of know the labor market in your area. You may not know the labor market in other areas. Typically, maybe if you're hiring somebody across the country, it's because there's an association somehow. But just to go out and hire a labor force that you don't know, never met, is, I think, challenging at times. And I don't believe companies have taken advantage of. Now the labor market is open across the country versus just within a 50-kilometer radius. So, I think those are some of the things that companies will have to look at eventually and say, well, how do I recruit? How do I retain a staff? And where do I start looking for that pool of that labor force?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that, and the remote working challenges and the flexibility affects not just BPOs or outsourcers, also affects the clients and the creditors, as an example, or energy companies, etc. I mean, what are the challenges that they've got? I mean, one of the things we've seen here have been, I mean, it's got termed the Great Resignation that's being on. There's a lot of churn that's going on in the market. It feels like there's a lot of sort of like open positions in the market, certainly here. I mean, are you seeing something similar, and is that a challenge that creditors are having too?
Yeah, the creditors are experiencing the same thing as, just the debt buyers who, basically send their account maybe out to collection agencies, law firms. I mean, it's a labor force, that, as you mentioned, that are basically looking for higher salaries, better positions. Remote working is a big issue. There's bonus incentives, that they're getting to move from one company to the next. So right now, I would say that the labor market has control a bit of sort of their own destiny and where they want to move to. Example, my wife has, basically hired a very good analyst, and that analyst manager has been with the company for a year and a half, and now they got recruited and they're working from home, but the company has invested a year and a half in that development, and it's gone, like this. So I think that's sort of the challenges out there.
It's quite interesting in terms of where do you think that plays out in terms of, do you think it plays out more to that model of you've got to invest yourself in your own development because companies will pull back from that because there isn't the loyalty or the stickability within a role, so you sort of invest in it and you're not going to get the return? Do you think it's going to sort of further force that kind of agenda on? So like, I'm responsible for my own development, so I need to invest in it, and I'll make choices as I want to, rather than companies doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to do is really have those open discussions with our labor force and see, the environments that we're creating, the culture that we're creating in our own companies. How does that translate over to the employee who has to work a certain amount of number or hours per day, and really trying to get them focused on our core values and sort of where we want to move the company and what direction we're moving it in. Are they a part of those discussions? And I think those are some of the things where, before with the market, you were able to go out and hire 3 or 5 people very quickly and get them trained, and you can do a lot of replacement of labor. Now you have to really invest that time and energy in that labor force because of productivity gaps, because of labor force. So I think training has to be at the forefront of companies now, and really investing in these employees.
But I'm also hearing about, as much as investing in the training of the employees, is also about making sure that you're investing in spending the time with the employees so they're vested back in the company as well, so they stay, so you get the return back from the training as well.
And that's the biggest issue. How do they get connected to a business that they're working from home? And that is some of the challenges where, the water cooler, talks between employees, we always looked at that as a productivity gap, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something that was useful that got them connected to the business, got them connected to people. And when you're in an environment where, you have colleagues that you like, and you come to work in a social environment, maybe that gets you connected to the business as well. And we've kind of lost a little bit of that. So how do you recreate a culture when you're in the comforts of your home, right?
Yeah. I mean, how many times you say at a company, because you got a great boss, you got a great bunch of colleagues, and you're just having a great time, you're having a laugh when you're there, you're getting your stuff done. But I mean, it really adds to it as much as the actual, the pay itself, right? I mean, it seems like that piece has been undervalued, do you think, and historically?
Oh, 100%. I mean, we used to go out after work and socialize. Maybe not in my later stages in life during my career, but at the beginning, it was an important part, as much as growth in my career and growth in my salary. Creating these friendships that even today I still have friendships when I first got into business, right?
Yeah.
So that connectivity has been lost, and unfortunately, we're going to have to look at other ways to get people connected to businesses and to people as well.
So, and what are your thoughts on that in terms of like how to do that? How to get people connected?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. I think you have to rotate your workforce to come in to be connected to the offices that they work in, the businesses, the people. I think that's a big challenge. And how do you do that when a workforce is basically saying, no, I'm not going to come in?
Yeah.
And how do you do it in a safe environment as well?
Yeah. So, and I suppose, so we talked a bit about, employees, talked a bit about, what that means for them. But then I suppose you also got the customer piece. I mean, and the whole change that's happened is, you have vulnerability that comes up, different types of treatments that might come up from a customer point of view. I mean, what have you seen from that in terms of impacts that have happened in terms of the customer base at your clients or your clients' clients? What's kind of changed?
Well, like I mentioned, we have we're a national debt buyer. So we purchase debt from creditors, and then we assign it to a network of 10 agencies, 2 law firms. And we also have an internal group that work accounts as well, in more of a customer-centric type environment. And that's sort of where our company has decided to look at new ways of how do we collect more money, how do we treat our customer, and what offerings do we provide them. So before, it was all about payment in full, offering maybe settlements, and there was a population of individuals who couldn't afford making those large payments to cover the balance. So now we're looking at prolonged payment plans, and then we are also doing a lot more analytics on the vulnerability sector of these debt pools that we acquire, and how do we treat somebody who are in a vulnerable situation. I think the definition of vulnerable also is, it could be financially, it could be mentally, it could be social environments that they're in. So there's a lot of different factors of what's considered as vulnerable. But I think what we've done is we've taken that different approach by segmenting and really isolating a pool or a pocket of inventory that we deem as vulnerable, and that we're taking different steps on trying to maybe do debt reconciliation, looking at interest freeze, looking at maybe prolonged smaller payment plans. And sometimes what happens even in payment plans is we analyze and we basically talk to the consumer, and we get them on a payment plan of $250 per month. And then they default on that payment plan because the payment was too high for that consumer. So is it better to get a $100 payment plan and have that consistent over a long period of time until situations do change, or that they can pay off the entire balance through interest relief, right, or through a reconsolidation of debt?
I know that the Canadian market was more focused, as an example, on you talked a bit about payments, or getting accounts up to date, those kind of things. I mean, how's that approach on vulnerability expanded across the Canadian market in terms of the approach around collections? Is is that something that you think that's developing? Is that sort of like a new area that's developing, or is it really rolled out as a result of the pandemic? Do you think more on a more wide basis other than Pyxis?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always treated a vulnerable population, maybe not to the extent that we are today. I think it's in Canada, it's certainly developing a lot slower than the UK market. I think a few months ago there was a conference in the UK specifically around vulnerability. So it is a new topic in Canada, and I think it's an important one, especially with the pandemic. And how we treat a pocket of consumers, maybe that we have to put a more customer-centric approach to it, and try to find ways and solutions and get them into the right payment plans or the right financial situations so that they can resolve some of their financial debt, because it's just compounding. It's one debt over next with high interest rates in some cases. So how do you try to find a financial resolution for that consumer?
One of the things I found quite interesting is actually by focusing on the outcomes and getting good outcomes, you can actually get almost like better stick rates and better payments. You talked about your $100. I mean, that over the longer term, the lifetime, you actually get more payment as a result of that, and you actually get better outcomes for the customer. And it's not, the fear is that you won't get that, but in fact, a lot of the evidence shows that you do.
Yeah, I think it's just having a dialogue and with the consumer and really focusing on where they're at, and education is sometimes a big part of that. Informing the consumer, walking the consumer, holding their hand through that process, and really building, in any relationship, building that relationship so that there's a trust factor there, and when there are hard times, you can adapt as well and change, because maybe that $100 eventually will have to go down to a lower amount, and then it'll increase back up again. But you have to have those dialogues with your consumers.
Yeah, and it's almost like like history goes in circles, and it's almost like we've gone back full circle through, from in the olden days, I suppose you'd have this interpersonal relationship with your bank manager, and you'd know your situation. We've gone through all this digitalization, outsourcing, and now we're saying, well, actually, it also comes back to having that, knowing your customer to a certain extent, and working out solutions on almost like an individual basis.
Exactly, and that's sort of to your point. Do you really know your banking manager? And the answer is probably not, right? Because you don't go in to the bricks and mortar anymore, or very rarely do you. So we've had to adapt to how do we communicate with these consumers in a customer-centric way, and that could be through traditional dialers and making telephone attempts. But you also have a certain population that don't want to speak to you. So how do you reach out to them? How do you communicate through different omni channels? And we've had to adapt to that environment using email campaigns, text messages, and just other omni-channel avenues that are available to us and to the end user, and see how we connect with them as well. So, part of omni-channel is also social media, right? So how do you get connected to a consumer through not only your omni-channel avenues, but also through social media platforms and education, so that the consumer, prior to them actually being in contact with you, know a little bit about the company, right? And know sort of what's available to them. So the education that builds trust, then through the omni-channel or traditional one-on-one conversations through the phone, have produced some better results as well.
And you've seen greater uptake in, I suppose, in things like messaging. So there's either SMS messaging, there can be mobile messaging, there can be web messaging. Have you seen greater take up in those kind of like digital channels than there was sort of 2-3 years ago? Is that sort of really sort of lifting off?
Yeah, I think it was starting to become more relevant in even 5 years ago. I think obviously it may have sped up because of sort of the areas that we're in. You used to have a workforce that basically were there from 8 to 5, and it was really hard to reach them during the day, but at night you probably could. Now they're so connected to their personal devices, and so your contact hours and channels have changed dramatically as well. So,
and then that makes a difference from an operational point of view, and it spreads out those traditional peak contact times of morning and evening, and maybe a little bit over lunch, to much more sort of even across the day, does it? So that's easy to staff for, I would think, as well.
Yeah, and you also have you have consumers that are connected to their personal devices 24/7. I mean,
yeah,
certain age groups, I mean, that thing doesn't leave their pocket, right? And they're not picking up the phone. They don't make phone calls. It's the last thing that they want to do is dial a number. They don't speak to their friends over the phone. So they're doing it through text messages and WhatsApp and different other platforms, but they're not making phone calls. So we've had to really change our environment, how we do business, and how we try to connect with our customers.
And so you talked a bit about, I suppose, you're a debt purchaser as well, and it'd be good just to explore a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the debt purchase market. I mean, how's that sort of been impacted? And certainly, what I've sort of seen here or in Europe was, it felt like that sort of fell off a cliff, where everyone just sort of just stood back and just waited to see what to do. And there's been sort of certainly some interest now in terms of well, now what do we do? And they sort of built up some inventory in terms of potential sales. I mean, what's been your experience in North America?
Yeah, I think very similar. I mean, it went through, a period of time where it was very dormant, and I think it's maybe starting to pick back up. Creditors are starting to look at, and in Canada specifically, the debt buying space is starting to increase. You have more and more banks and telcos who are selling debt now, where 10 years ago they weren't. And I think once you've had the opportunity to understand the debt purchase space and how it could be a complement to your bottom line or year-end bottom line, I think more and more businesses are going to look at how do they sell their warehouse debt, or how they sell their charge off and forward flow debt as well. So I think it's maybe helped us that dormant period, and now companies are starting to look at new ways to maybe pad their bottom lines, right?
Yeah.
So.
And I suppose what's happened over the last year or so, I mean, it's sort of often your pricing on debt is really dependent on the performance you might have seen over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, how much is that sort of obscuring in terms of valuations? I mean, how much extra pricing is built in, or discount on pricing is built in because you don't necessarily know what the performance is over the last 3 years, because it's been obfuscated to a certain extent by the pandemic.
Yeah, great question. I think for us, we do a lot of data mining, right, to understand the debt pools and try to figure out where, in certain pockets of the debt file that maybe, is undervalued, and we have to put a higher price point to that. And then there's a certain segment of that other debt pool that may be under, maybe we have to really look at pricing a little bit differently. So AI is a big part of how we data mine, and when you look at it as a debt purchaser, we're a data company. So data is so much more important today to be able to do the right price evaluations on those debt pools, right? So we've had to become a lot better at data mining and using artificial intelligence to give us the valuations, because maybe before our appetite was at a certain level, and because we didn't have the data mining behind it, our risk for appetite was X, and we would just stay at that price point, where now maybe it either protects us or allows us to be a lot more competitive on pricing, because we have a lot of the analytics behind it to be able to go out and be confident that we'll be able to recover certain liquidation performance.
And I suppose and the market for data and the amount of data that's available, it seems to be sort of growing sort of dramatically. I mean how much more data do you think we can get, and how much more value is going to add in terms of like further fine tuning those price points? I mean, it feels like data keeps expanding in terms of data, on indicative data at least anyway, as well as the techniques to really understand what the pricing would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be too much data out there.
Okay.
I mean, you're going to talk to a lot of people and say there's not enough data out there.
Yeah.
But, I think it's something that as long as you have the systems that are built in that can get you to, looking at a historical liquidation curve over a 12, 24, 36 month period, I think, as long as you're focused on the right data fields, then additional information is always obviously better. It's how you use that data. And, we see a lot of companies where they don't use the data properly. And therefore there's work gaps because they're paying for the data, but they're not utilizing it properly. That's another big issue.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it has to be more data is good, but it has to be the right data, because if it's the wrong data, it's just going to distract you, right? So sort of like winnowing that down so it's the right data is actually important. And I suppose in terms of arrears and arrears levels, what's your view in terms of that? I mean, it feels like that's been quite relatively benign, at least, and we've kind of seen with the support that's happened. But I mean, certainly there's potential risks on the horizon with things like energy prices, as an example. And there's obviously a lot of change in the employment market as well. I mean, do you think arrears levels are going to change fundamentally, and is that going to have an impact on both the collections industry market, but also the debt purchase market as well?
Yeah, specifically in Canada, we've lost sort of that mid-market lender, right? So a lot of the lenders have pulled out of Canada. So there is a gap there. And, obviously, we have to look at, finance companies a little bit differently. Debt loads have increased significantly. Yeah. If you look at the cost of living, I think Canada is close to 4.5% inflation. The cost of goods, food, housing, those are really taking a big toll on people's, debt load, right? So they're paying for the basics, and food being probably one of the highest commodities out there. Gas prices have significantly elevated in Canada. So people are paying just for the basics of life right now. And so debt loads are increasing. Housing prices are probably where consumers, at least in certain areas in Canada, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary, Edmonton, sort of those areas where are people investing in their houses as part of their retirement plan. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing right now and then you have a new age group that can't afford getting into the housing market because it's just too expensive to purchase a house. Yeah. So, they're living at home a lot longer with their parents. And so those are some of the challenges, and, how we come out of this is going to, even with the government subsidies, I think it was good at the beginning of the pandemic. And now I think governments have to start opening, the economy up and changing some of that behavior, which was good at the beginning and maybe not as good today.
Yeah. And so the debt loads, and particularly the housing market, it feels like people could get quite exposed to interest rate increases as well. I mean, as well as the energy costs as well. I mean, certainly, gas prices, natural gas prices, or gas prices as in petrol, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's what we're starting to face. And we're hearing more and more about sort of these areas of concern and how, the economists are coming out saying, the bubble's about to burst and we're going to have to really change the way we do things, because it's not sustainable over a long period of time.
And I mean, I know you've been in the industry a long time, and you've seen a few of these cycles. I mean, in terms of like, I mean, what the best preparation for that in terms of being prepared, and what the impact's going to be on arrears processes, collections processes. I mean, what's your kind of guidance on that?
Well, I think sort of that's where we've adapted to a different way of collecting, right? We're using more business partners to get us to the area that we need to be at from a liquidity standpoint. We have to look at new ways of customer treatment and how we're resolving consumer debt loads, right? We have to look at sort of interest relief. How do we offer settlements? How do we offer payment plans? How do we provide a higher elevated service to these consumers? So customer centricity, although we've been talking about it for years and years and years, and it's always been sort of at the forefront, we still have to be, cognizant that there is, different ways to help these consumers, and vulnerability is one of the things that we've highly focused on this year, and going into 2022, it'll be a greater mandate as we get more educated on how to deal with vulnerability. And I think it's going to get even worse if there's a labor shortage out there. How do we provide that high level of customer service when you don't have a workforce to be able to support that? And I think automation is key right now.
I mean, I think it's fascinating through this whole thing is just the similarities there are between different markets, and as terrible as the pandemic's been, one of the things it has done is it's kind of brought a lot of us together, right? In terms of, you can start to see some of the similarities. You can have these conversations as well very easily, which maybe we wouldn't have done sort of like 5 years ago even. It's fascinating, right? So it does feel like we're moving towards that sort of like focus around vulnerability and individual sort of customer treatment, and it's kind of going full circle to the way it used to be. Yeah, sort of like, like 10 years ago.
You remember you and I were talking always in the Amex days about globalization.
Yeah.
Right. And how it was important at that point, and how it's changed. Right. So it's changed our environment, and maybe this is a new way of dealing with businesses and understanding best practices, where now some of the best practices, if Canada's ahead of the curve or behind the curve, maybe it changes because now we're communicating better between different countries and so on. So I think the pandemic has allowed us to do that. So there's been some rough times with the pandemic, but I think it's also given us opportunities to stay connected with people through these types of channels.
One of the things I think is also true is just, you mentioning that, is when we talk about it, there's a lag between when we talk about something, for example, globalization and sharing best practice, and then when it happens. And usually that's around a sort of like, it feels like it's a decreasing time period, but it's maybe that used to be 5 years ago. So think about the .com bust. And we're all talking about it, but the reality is sort of, within the last sort of 5 years, we're doing everything now online. And you can sort of draw out these sort of, almost like these timelines where it's sort of like that's getting shorter and shorter. It's almost like maybe we're talking about globalization 5 years ago, but now it's actually happening as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that part of it. I think, you look at the United States, you look at, Buy America First. So even though globalization is certainly an important topic, and learning about best practices and all that, there's still a regional component to it. And sort of every, not every, especially in Canada, we have different, it's a fairly large country from a space standpoint, and it creates different cultural differences, and sort of how do you adapt to those pockets of individuals across a widespread country, right? So those are some of the challenges that we've had to deal with as well. We have a population that's transient now, that move a lot quicker. So you have to be able to adapt there a lot faster, and try to get connected to those individuals.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting theme in terms of like localization. So we do have this sort of, we can share best practice, but it's almost like even on the individual basis as well. When we're talking about treatment, it's also around localized treatment as well, which is the same kind of theme. So as we sort of expand and become almost like the danger become very homogenized, people are almost like desperate to search for that. What does that mean for me? How do I reflect my local community? How do I reflect my local culture within the treatment as well? And businesses have to adapt to that, it seems.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. And we've stayed focused on that as well. So
yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and Jason, thanks very much for making the time to chat to me. And it's interesting to see all the different dynamics that are going on. I mean, similarities, but also different perspectives as well. I think it's fascinating. So I really appreciate you making the time.
Oh, no worries. It was nice speaking to you again and seeing that you're doing well. And